today's guest, Garrett Graff. And Garrett is a distinguished journalist and historian, and he has spent nearly 2 decades covering technology, national security, and he serves as the director of cyber initiatives for the Aspen Institute and is a contributor to Wired, CNN, and has written from Esquire, Rolling Stone, New York Times, to name a few publications, and is the editor of 2 of Washington's most prestigious magazines, the Washingtonian and Politico Magazine. He has also written a number of books, including The Threat Matrix, Raven Rock, and his most recent book that we'll be discussing today, Only Plane in the Sky, An Oral History of 9/11, which was a New York Times bestseller and a #1 national bestseller. So thank you so much for joining us today. And I should mention, as always, the amazing Allison Kraft is also with us today, and she will be taking your questions later on. So hello, Garrett. Thank you for joining us this weekend, this beautiful Sunday.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, my first question that I wanted to ask is, what made you decide to write this book as an oral history? And I know you interviewed over 450 subjects. And what made you decide to do that instead of telling it from your own narrative?
Yeah, so this book actually grew out of a piece that I wrote for Politico Magazine in the spring, in the fall of 2016, the 15th anniversary. That was an oral history of being aboard Air Force One with President Bush. And President Bush's day, of course, as we now remember, it began in Emma Booker Elementary School in Sarasota, Florida, where he was speaking and reading with that elementary school class as he, when he was interrupted by his chief of staff, Andy Card, told the U.S. was under attack, and then his day unfurled from there. He was rushed aboard Air Force One, put into the skies over the Gulf of Mexico, eventually landing in Barksdale Air Force Base in Shreveport, Louisiana, then hopping on to Offutt Air Force Base outside Omaha, Nebraska, and then finally back to the White House for his Oval Office address that evening to the nation. The reaction that I got to that piece in 2016 was surprising and overwhelming to me. And there were 2 letters that stood out for me. And this is what motivated me 5 years ago, but it's sort of particularly poignant and odd to tell this story this week as we watch the images out of Afghanistan and mark the sacrifice of the 13 Marines and sailors who died protecting the Kabul airport this week, only 2 of whom were actually old enough to be out of diapers on 9/11. So 5 years ago, I got these 2 letters among other reader reactions. One was from a mother, a veteran, who had 2 children, 7 and 9 at the time. And she said that she had printed out my article and set it aside so that someday when her children were old enough to read, she could sit them down and explain to them why mommy had left them to go off to war. The second was another letter from another veteran, younger, an Army veteran. He had done 3 tours at that time, 2 in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. And he had been in middle school on 9/11, as was actually the oldest of the Marines who was killed this past week, who was in the 6th grade on 9/11. And this soldier said that he had never really understood the national trauma of 9/11 until he had read that article and seen the day through President Bush's eyes. And one of the things that really just stood out to me in both of those reactions is the idea that we were handing off this war on terror to a new generation, the people who had been raised in a world created by 9/11, but had never actually understood the emotion and the visceral reaction that those of us who lived through that day recall. And that's an important part of trying to understand the history of 9/11, because the history that we teach to a new generation, and that's why it's sort of so great to be talking to a group like this today that sort of focuses on how we tell history and how we keep history alive for future generations. The story that we teach of 9/11 is this very neat, tidy, simple story of 9/11. We talk about the 4 planes. We talk about the first attack beginning at 8:46 that morning. We talk about the whole thing being over 102 minutes later with the collapse of the second tower at 10:28 a.m. We talk about the Pentagon, Shanksville, the Twin Towers. But that's not the day that any of us who were alive on 9/11 actually lived. That the day that we lived, we didn't know when the attacks began. We didn't know when they were over. We didn't know for most of the day how many attacks there even had been. That well into the early afternoon, there was the fear that there might be a dozen more hijacked planes high in the sky aiming for targets across the country. There were fears that day of a car bomb at the State Department, that the White House had been under attack, that there had been shootings, that there had been other bombings across the country. And that most of all, on 9/11, we didn't know what came next. We didn't know whether there was a second wave attack for that afternoon, or for Wednesday, or for Friday, or for October. We didn't know what 2002 would bring. And that it was that combination of all of those factors, the chaos, the confusion, the fear, the trauma, that is so important to understand about why 9/11 means what it does to our country. Because it was that fear, that chaos, that confusion, that trauma that drove the US government's response, that drove the American response, drove the Western response, and everything that has unfurled since.
So true. And you open with the perspective aboard the International Space Station. Can you describe why you decided to start there?
Yeah, so I mean, in some ways, so the opening, as you say, of this book, it's all oral history. So it's all people talking about their own experiences, sliced up chronologically over the course of the day. You hear from about 480 people who experienced that day, morning to night, coast to coast, just the day of 9/11. And the goal of that oral history tradition in this format was to put people back in 9/11 knowing only what they knew at 9/11. That they, that you sort of live the day through their eyes knowing only what they knew as the events unfolded. And a big part of that experience for me, I was in Boston at the time. A big part of that experience for me, for people across the rest of the country, and indeed around the world, was that 9/11 was really the first global catastrophe we have ever had. That the timing of those attacks at 9 a.m. on the East Coast meant that basically the whole world was able to watch. That it was early afternoon, mid-afternoon for Europe, that actually the attacks caught much of Asia as it was preparing to go to sleep. And so we watched the attacks and the aftermath unfold in those first couple of hours as a globe together. And that this was an attack, and this is sort of why I begin with Frank Culbertson, who was aboard the International Space Station that day, the only American off the planet Earth, because he could see the attacks. He was able to watch 9/11 unfold from outer space. That's just how big the attacks actually were that day. And that his perspective floating so far above the earth, I think sort of gives a sense of sort of just how monumental these attacks actually were, and just how, in a weird way, unifying it was for everyone watching below, that we sort of all watched the same thing unfold on television that day.
So one person describes surviving because they forgot the key to their office. Was there any particular story of survival that really stuck out to you?
Well, so the theme that stuck out to me is exactly what you singled out there, which is time and again on 9/11, you see these incredibly poignant decisions, the types of which we make on any given day 1,000 times without understanding the alternate universes that we are unlocking. That the decision of when to get a cup of coffee, when to step outside and get a cigarette, when to run an errand, when to send a fax, what you have for breakfast, what plane you catch, what bus you catch, what train you catch on your morning commute, on that day ends up being the difference between life and death. And you see this play out in ways big and small. Michael Lamonaco, the chef at Windows on the World, the restaurant atop the North Tower, he survives that day. Because he normally would have been at his desk in his kitchen by 8:30 on a Tuesday morning like that. But that morning of all mornings, he stops and gets a new pair of glasses at LensCrafters in the lobby of the World Trade Center and misses the last elevator up to the restaurant. Dozens, scores of his colleagues that day die, and he lives. You see that in one of the stories that I tell about Cantor Fitzgerald, the Monica O'Leary on Monday, September 10th, was the unluckiest person at Cantor Fitzgerald. She is laid off on Monday afternoon. We sort of forget that like the U.S. was struggling a little bit with an economic recession just before 9/11, and so she is a part of a wave of layoffs at Cantor Fitzgerald on Monday. The unluckiest person there. She goes around, collects the things at her desk, says goodbye to her team, goes home, and then the next day from the roof of her apartment building in New York, watches as the towers collapse and all of her coworkers are killed. She rejoins the firm the following week to help them rebuild, and she had never been taken off payroll because everyone in the HR department who would have done so on Tuesday morning died and perished in the attacks. You see this play out in the Pentagon. You see that morning the Pentagon hit by American Airlines Flight 77. It come in sort of right underneath this one conference room filled with Army Personnel Command. And the conference room erupts in flames and smoke and utter darkness as the power is lost inside the building. They evacuate this conference room, and everyone who turns left dies, and everyone who turns right lives. And just these incredibly small decisions that end up playing such a big day and such a big way in how that day unfolds.
Can you tell us where the title of the book comes from?
Yeah, so the title, The Only Plane in the Sky, is the title of the original piece that I did for Politico Magazine in 2016 about President Bush in the air that day. And it's a reference from actually a Secret Service agent who was aboard during that final leg back to Washington on the afternoon of September 11th. They keep the president away from Washington until they are sure that every other plane in the sky has landed. The last plane in the sky that day was a U.S. Airways flight from Madrid that lands around 3 p.m. on Tuesday afternoon, and then President Bush leaves to fly back to Washington around 4 p.m. And the agent says to some of the other passengers, you know, we're the only plane in the sky left in the United States today.
So there's so many stories of heroism in the book, but one that stuck out to me that's just not told very often is about the flight controllers, air traffic controllers. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? Because I just thought that was extraordinary.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you asked about that, because this is part of what makes this day so amazing to relive, and particularly so interesting to come back to, 15, 20 years afterward, is there is so much that we didn't realize was happening on that day. That these events, these stories, that if they had occurred on any other day in modern American history, would have been among the most dramatic things to have ever happened in modern American history. And yet on 9/11 are not even among the 10 or 12 most dramatic things that we were aware of that day. And there are three that I sort of really zero in on and try to tell and follow through that day. One of which is the story of air traffic control that day. Ben Sliney, the national operations manager for the FAA, the head of the U.S. airspace, was on his first day on the job on the morning of Tuesday, September the 11th. And in his first 2 hours on the job, he gives two orders that no American has ever given before or since. He gives an order shortly after the second attack at 9:03 to institute a nationwide ground stop. Any plane that is still on the ground is not going to be allowed to take off. Then, after the third attack, the crash at the Pentagon, or at 9:37, he gives another order: land everything now. And every plane in the air in the United States, all 4,500 planes, are to be forced down at the closest airport, regardless of the plane's destination and regardless of whether the airport is in any way prepared to receive those incoming planes. And it is this Herculean effort by air traffic controllers. Ben Sliney's not even legally sure that he has the authority to give that order, but air traffic control across that day implements it. And he watches as in the next 10 minutes, air traffic controllers across the country put 750 planes on the ground at airports across the country, most of whom, airport-wise, were not expecting incoming flights at all. This is a story that, if Americans sort of know the story at all, they're only familiar with this tiny little slice of it. The 38 transatlantic flights that are forced down in Gander, Newfoundland, over the course of that morning, dumping 7,000 passengers and crew onto an island and town of just 9,000 people. Where they are going to, they end up staying for the next 3 days until the U.S. airspace actually reopens. So, this is an incredible effort by these air traffic controllers, and it is, it's this story that we sort of don't know because it worked. One of the things that is so wild to think about is that amid these 4,500 other planes, several dozen of which, it's worth adding, air traffic controllers believe are likely hijacked. We believe, the U.S. government believes, until about noon, 1 p.m. that day, that there are perhaps as many as a dozen more hijacked planes still in the sky. And yet on that day, except for the 4 hijacked planes, every other civilian aircraft in the sky lands safely.
Can you describe your research process a little bit for us?
Yeah, so I did, this book was a mix of archival and original interviews. There were a number of institutions that had the foresight and the brilliance to go out and do large-scale oral history projects immediately after 9/11. There was the 9/11 Museum, the 9/11 Tribute Center, Columbia University, Stony Brook University, the Flight 93 National Memorial, the Pentagon, the Fire Department of New York, the Arlington County Public Library System in Virginia, the site of the Pentagon, the U.S. House Historians, C-SPAN, a dozen or more institutions went out and did large-scale oral histories, and then Many more local libraries and historical societies did much more community-focused ones. The Museum of the Chinese in America, in New York, actually, did a really remarkable oral history project just zeroing in on the Chinese community in New York City and how they experienced the attacks. Almost no one did anything with any of these oral histories, and they just sat on a shelf for 10, 15, 20 years. And so I spent about the first year of this book project. I hired an oral historian from the 9/11 Museum, Jenny Pachuki, who worked with me for a year to go around and locate and identify these existing archival interviews. We found about 5,000 across the country, pulled and collected about 2,000 of them that we sort of read through and began to sort into the pile that became this book. And the book ends up being the stories about 480 people, 400 of whom are from those archival works. And then I went out and did about 200 oral histories and recollections, stories that I collected myself, about 80 of which made it into the book. And so this ends up being, sort of almost an impressionistic painting in many ways of how that day unfolded across the country in the voices of the people who experienced it. And as you know from reading it, there are very few people that you sort of follow through the whole day. There are probably only a few dozen voices that you see through the whole day from morning to night. But most people sort of just come and go as they experience the dramatic part of the day that is relevant to the story.
Yeah, and it's really powerful how you even captured the voices of the people who perished that day through voicemails, and the way you sort of used a different font to just show the transcripts of their messages. That was incredibly powerful to just have them included in there as well.
Yeah, and it's an interesting and sort of challenging historiographic question, right? Which is the challenge of an oral history is it is a tale that you are naturally relying upon only survivors to participate in. And so on 9/11, what we tried to do in the book is to try to go back and get the audio and the experiences of those who perished in the ways that their voices were captured that day. And so, it's some of the original audio of air traffic controllers, of the hijacked flights, the cockpit voice recorders, and then, voicemails or emails from victims to loved ones. And then the recollections of the survivors that they actually called that day to recount and try to tell some of those stories. And then, as you mentioned, that's sort of all set aside in a special font in the book. But a lot of that in the audiobook is actually the original audio from that day, which is incredibly powerful to actually listen to and hear as we sort of forget that much of that exists.
Amazing. Yeah. So, a majority of people in our audience, a lot of are teachers and students. And I was just wondering if you could think of ways teachers could utilize this work in their classrooms.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is actually a really important and sort of challenging question for this moment. This is 20 years after the attacks. So this is the moment that we see memory begin to slip into history. And that, if you are, by next year, America's college campuses will be effectively entirely people born after 9/11. A quarter of the United States are now too young to remember that attack. Either they were born afterwards or were too young on the day to have any real memory of it. And it's and yet it's an event that we are still very much wrestling with. I mean, like this week of all weeks, as we watch the news and see these images from Afghanistan, like we are still living in the world created by 9/11 and wrestling with what that world is. And yet for these students, even for the people fighting in Afghanistan, you know, they don't remember the world before. And so I think part of what is so important in telling the story of 9/11 and telling it particularly in this oral history format that I used for this book is it gives you a glimpse of what America was like before 9/11, which is you see that day what to me is sort of the most interesting moment of the entire day. It's these 17 minutes from the first attack to the second attack. And you see in those 17 minutes from 8:46 a.m. to 9:03 just how innocent America was on the morning of Tuesday, September the 11th. You see in that moment America look at that first attack. Remember, many hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people, you know, saw it live in New York City. For the rest of the country, the attacks were live on TV by 8:49, just 3 minutes after the crash into the North Tower. And so we watched from 8:46, from 8:49 until 9:03, and most of America shrugged. And it's this remarkable moment that you see play out in the stories of that morning, because Peter Johansson, the New York Waterways ferry captain, he talks about how he watched that first crash as he came across New York Harbor that morning. He pulls into Wall Street Terminal at the tip of Lower Manhattan, and every single commuter on his ferry gets off and walks into Lower Manhattan to go on to work that day. They walk off the boat through the confetti of debris and paper raining down from the damaged North Tower, but there's not a single person on the boat who looks at it and says, this just kind of seems like it's got a bad vibe to it. I'm going to turn around and go work from home for the day. In New York, you see, you know, commuters sort of go about their whole day, you know, or go about their morning. You see people in the South Tower sort of watch this fiery inferno across the plaza of the World Trade Center and go back to their desks in the South Tower. You see in Washington, Brian Gunderson, the the chief of staff to the House Majority Leader, Congressman Dick Armey, he walks into his office that morning. He sees the TV on in the reception room, sees the North Tower burning, and he says, I thought it was going to be like a bad school shooting, the type of thing that dominates national news but doesn't actually change anyone's day. And so he goes on into his 9 a.m. staff meeting on Capitol Hill. At the White House, Condoleezza Rice, the national security advisor, calls the president down in Florida. They both have sort of the same reaction that most Americans have. Probably a small plane. What a weird accident. Maybe the pilot had a heart attack. Maybe the plane had a mechanical function. Maybe air traffic control is having a really bad day. And they sort of say, well, we're going to have to wait to learn more. And Condi Rice goes on into her 9 a.m. staff meeting, and President Bush walks into that classroom at the elementary school.
And even that second, yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, but even in that second tower, they made an announcement telling people not to evacuate. So
exactly. You know, this incident is confined to the North Tower. Please don't evacuate. Remain at your desks. And you sort of see in those 17 minutes just this innocence play out coast to coast in a way that is like literally unimaginable to us today. and that it's not until 9/03 that you have that second plane and America sort of collectively realize that it is under attack. And you see that reaction in part because, before 9/11, we were just not afraid as a people. And I think when we talk about teaching the history of that day, that's one of the most important aspects of how that day unfolds, because we sort of don't realize how different our country was before. And so for these kids today, growing up in the world shaped by 9/11, it's a really important reminder that what they are used to, that this fear of public spaces, the idea of an active shooter in your school, is actually a new phenomenon in the United States. That I was born in 1981. I was in high school in the 1990s, at the end of the 1990s, and we remember Columbine because of how unusual it was. That yes, we had the Oklahoma City bombing. Yes, we had Columbine, but those were attacks that were rare and unusual before 9/11 and all of the anxiety and fear that has unfurled in our society ever since.
Fascinating. Well, now I'm going to pass you over to Allison, because I know we have a number of questions in the audience. And I believe we're going to start with our student question of the week.
We are indeed. And you are correct. There are a lot of questions and comments from our audience who are just so enthralled with this conversation. So as Gina said, we will start with a question from our student winner of the week. And that is Gabriel from California, who asks, what key moment led to the events of 9/11 to take place?
Oh, it's a great question. And I will actually rudely plug another of my projects for a moment, which is, this book is really just the day of 9/11. I spend very little time talking about what happened before or what happened since. But I have a podcast series that's actually just started this month in August, and it's 8 episodes running through September 11th called Long Shadow, that is about the lingering questions of 9/11. And it is sort of every episode is geared around one of the questions that I get most often from audiences when I'm speaking about that day. What was the target of United Airlines Flight 93? Why did the World Trade Center towers collapse when they did? And one of the episodes that is actually coming this week is about the events that led up to 9/11 and sort of the U.S. government's hunt for Al-Qaeda before 9/11, and basically sort of how the U.S. government dropped the ball on the attacks in the months leading up to September 2001. This is a story that a lot of people now don't really remember. And I was in college when 9/11 happened. I was a junior in college, and I remember exactly where I was standing that day when I saw the first photo of Osama bin Laden on the TV and heard people for the first time begin to talk about this thing called Al-Qaeda. And I remember being so baffled that morning because I had never heard of this guy, Osama bin Laden, and I had never heard of this group called Al-Qaeda. And yet everyone on TV seemed to be totally sure that this was the guy who had attacked us. And I just didn't understand how we had been attacked by this guy or this thing that I had never heard of. And, I have spent most of my professional career since then reporting on 9/11, the history leading up to it, the way that it has changed our government and our world since. And the story of sort of the US government and Al-Qaeda before 9/11 is a remarkable one. And most Americans don't realize that Osama bin Laden was so much on the radar of the US government that he had been on the FBI's 10 most wanted list as early as 1999, 2 years before the attacks. And that the US had been hot on his trail in the run-up to 9/11, and that sort of a combination of the FBI, the CIA, and the NSA all failed to do the appropriate work to, as we sort of came to say afterwards, connect the dots of the intelligence that could have led to that plot being disrupted, up to and including that the CIA knew that two of the would-be hijackers, Khalid al-Midhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, were inside the United States, that these known al-Qaeda operatives were inside the United States in the summer of 2001. And the CIA never bothered to tell the FBI that knowledge, to try to get the FBI to investigate what they were doing here and why they were inside the United States to begin with.
Well, people are sharing their stories, where they were on that day, and talking about their very emotional experiences. So I am doing my best to pass those through to incorporate that conversation amongst our audience members. And one of those individuals is Laura, who shared a story about how Laura was driving and listening to your audiobook, and also learning about her friend who had cancer. And so it was a lot of weight all at once, and is now sort of comparing what's happening in Afghanistan to its own sort of cancer. And Laura wants to know, how did you handle emotionally, working on this project for years?
So I actually laugh getting that question, because it leads to what is my dumbest comment about writing a book about 9/11, which is I drastically underestimated the emotional toll of writing a book about 9/11, and was totally unprepared for how emotional I ended up finding it. And that it is this day of such tragedy, and diving into those stories for 8 to 10 hours a day for the 3 or 4 months that I was writing the first draft of this book was remarkably overwhelming in a way that I had not anticipated. And I literally was crying every single day that I was writing this book, in that sort of first draft period. And there are still some parts of this book and some stories in it that I don't talk about when I am talking to audiences about the book, because I can't talk about them without crying. And yet, what I think, if you read the book, if you listen to the book, I hope what you get out of it is sort of what I ended up getting out of it, which is why the project actually ended up feeling manageable to me, which is this day that is marked by, unimaginable sorrow and tragedy, actually has a tremendous amount of hope, love, and incredible testimonials to the resilience of the human spirit. That if you sort of look at the day in total, if you look at the reactions that people had to that day, if you look at the sort of full sweep of the emotional responses to that day, you're just overwhelmed by love. You're overwhelmed by the resilience of the human spirit. And you see that in the love of families, the love of friends that day, and then you also see it more broadly in the love of our country that people experience that day. I remember this one one of the stories that I sort of broke up reading when I first came across it was of this like municipal volunteer coordinator in Arlington County, which is the municipality where the Pentagon is located, who was talking about all of the calls for volunteering help that she got that day. And she talks about the number of people who called and said, basically like, I'm an undocumented immigrant, but America is my homeland and my country, and can I come help with the rescue efforts at the Pentagon? And this just sort of incredible outpouring of support and love that unfolds over the course of that day. Talking earlier, I had mentioned that there's sort of three big storylines that I follow through the course of the day that are sort of mostly forgotten or unknown in the course of the popular history that we tell of that day. And one of them is the maritime boat lift evacuation of New York City. This story that most Americans didn't realize took place at all, that it was only months later that people actually came to understand the full scope of what had transpired that day. And this makeshift armada, this civilian armada of pleasure boats, ferry boats, tugboats, personal yachts, rescue boats, fishing vessels, that comes in and evacuates and affects what is the largest maritime evacuation in world history from the tip of Lower Manhattan that day, larger than the British evacuation of Dunkirk. Somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 people who are evacuated from Lower Manhattan that day, who have been trapped by the collapse of the towers and the closing of the bridges and tunnels out of New York City. And it was sort of basically there was no one running it. That there was this one junior Coast Guard officer, a lieutenant named Michael Day, who was aboard the Sandy Hook Benevolent Pilots Association pilot boat at the tip of Manhattan, who puts out a call on the Marine radio: all available boats, report to Lower Manhattan for evacuation. And over the next 20 minutes, he just stands there and watches as the harbor fills with these boaters coming from all over to just pull civilians, anyone that they can, off the seawall across Lower Manhattan, and ferry them to Brooklyn, to Staten Island, and New Jersey. And there's no organization, there's no government organization that has a plan for doing this. It's just, this is what New Yorkers did that morning, what people from across the New York area did that morning to try to help rescue each other.
This next question comes from David, who asks, do you have any suggestions on how to handle conspiracy theories related to 9/11? Many students gravitate towards them, and it can be a challenge to get them to focus on what we can prove versus what we can't prove.
Yeah, so I have, this is an issue that comes up, unfortunately in 9/11 history much more than anyone who reports and writes and studies that day would like. I think that the 9/11 conspiracy theories are a unfortunate testament in their own way to how hard conspiracy theories are to root out once they take place, once they take root, and that in some ways I think it's actually a very serious warning to us as a country about, for instance, how long we might be living with QAnon in our politics, as we sort of watch that unfold as the modern day equivalent of some of these 9/11 conspiracy theories. They are, incredibly vile and awful ideas. All of which have at the core the idea that the U.S. government is complicit in the murder of thousands of its own citizens, you see them sort of play out in all sorts of different forums and different questions. Popular Mechanics actually did an incredible magazine for the 5th anniversary of 9/11, totally dedicated to debunking 9/11 conspiracy theories. It's all online, and it's a great resource if you're trying to combat sort of like an individual conspiracy theory. My sort of broader answer, unfortunately, to how to combat conspiracy theories sort of more generally is, I've covered U.S. government and national security and intelligence for the better part of 20 years now. And the reason that I have come to not buy into conspiracy theories is simply that all of them presuppose a level of competence in our government that is not actually on display in any other work that the government actually does. That, the idea that any sort of slice of these conspiracy theories could have been true, and yet over the last 20 years, you have not seen meaningful proof emerge from any of what would have ended up being a vast conspiracy confronting and involving the participation of dozens, hundreds, and ultimately thousands of government workers and private sector engineers and contractors and rescue personnel, and from all, government agencies all across the government, and that none of them over 20 years have ever come forward to speak about what they know or what they covered up, I think is the clearest evidence that there isn't anything worth pursuing in the conspiracy theories.
Our next question comes from LaDonna, who asks, was there any evidence that there were other planes that had hijackers on board but landed before they could take over the plane?
So this is actually a great question, and one that I only fully answered for myself as part of working on this podcast this year. One of the episodes that will also be coming this week, as it turns out, is was there a fifth plane on 9/11? This has sort of always existed as this vague urban legend, urban rumor that it sort of floats around the edges of 9/11 history. The idea that there is a fifth plane out there. It's never mentioned in the 9/11 Commission report. The FBI has never spoken publicly about it. And for this podcast, I actually tracked down what the plane was, and interviewed the pilot about that day, and interviewed the pilot of that plane. And it was a flight that was United Airlines Flight 23 from JFK to Los Angeles that day. The same sort of specifications, if you will, that the other planes that day experienced. An East Coast transcontinental flight ending in Los Angeles. and that it was a plane that never took off that morning. Tom Manello was the pilot, and Carol Timmons was the co-pilot, the first officer that day. And they were still on the runway at JFK when that nationwide ground stop that I mentioned earlier was instituted. And they returned to the terminal, and along the way they got warnings from flight attendants who were aboard that day that there were 4 agitated men who appeared to be Middle Eastern or Arab in first class, people who were worried and asking about why the plane wasn't taking off. And those passengers melted away into the crowd of at JFK as the airport was being evacuated. The FBI says that it tracked them down and interviewed them. And I interviewed for this podcast as well the case agent, the lead FBI investigator for 9/11, who says that she is convinced that based on the investigation that they actually did, that there were only 4 planes and 4 sets of hijackers that morning, that there are no links to other teams of hijackers on other planes that day.
We have time for 2 more questions. There are a lot of questions asking for that third story that stands out to you. You mentioned yes. ATC and the evacuation, but what's that third story?
So the third story is the story of basically the U.S. government's response that morning, which was the story of Dick Cheney being hidden away in the bunker underneath the White House. Vice President Cheney that morning, not technically in the U.S. military chain of command, and yet that morning finds himself feeling like he is in charge of the U.S. government. President Bush is in Florida. Donald Rumsfeld is missing at the Pentagon. In the minutes, in those first minutes after the attack, there was some question of whether Don Rumsfeld had actually been killed at the Pentagon. And he ends up actually doing what is exactly the right thing for as a human and as an organizational leader. And he goes to the crash site himself that morning at the Pentagon and helps carry wounded out of the rubble. It is exactly the wrong thing to do as Secretary of Defense. And that morning he ends up being MIA during the first hours the U.S. government is trying to put together its response. And Dick Cheney in this bunker alone ends up trying to figure out how to marshal a government response. And he ends up telling the story, or he ends up actually giving an order that any further hijacked airliners should be shot down that day, an order that is translated out to U.S. fighters up and down the East Coast, of which there were not very many. And in fact, 2 of them are scrambled into the sky from Andrews Air Force Base outside of Washington that were set for training that morning. And so the planes are unarmed. They are going up into the sky with no missiles. And the only thing that the pilots have that morning, Heather Lucky Penny and Mark Sassville, the 2 pilots being scrambled into the air that morning aboard F-16s, is they think they're going out on a kamikaze mission, that they are thinking that that the only thing that they have to do that morning is actually crash their own plane into a hijacked airliner. This sort of incredible story of what is ultimately a very brave but ineffective and meaningless response that the U.S. government is able to muster ends up being the story that is, again, largely unknown. And I guess I will. I did not intend to plug the podcast this much, but it's the third episode, which just came out last week, where we sort of look at this moment in this series of decisions as Vice President Cheney tries to figure out what the U.S. government is going to do in response to 9/11 that morning.
We have time for one final question, and this question comes from Richard, who says, immediately after 9/11, there was an overwhelming sense of patriotism and harmony amongst the masses, particularly in New York. I recall legendary levels of kindness between perfect strangers. Please, thank you, and you're welcome were never uttered with frequency throughout history. Just kidding, of course, he says. Can we get back to that level of love and harmony without another national trauma occurring?
Yeah, so I think that this, this is obviously one of the most complicated legacies of that day, which is you have this moment that starts with literally unprecedented American and global unity in that response. It is the only time in world history that NATO has invoked Article 5 of its charter, the idea that an attack on one member state is an attack on all. And NATO ends up being a partner in the invasion of Afghanistan that takes place that fall. NATO, an incredibly important part of that effort, literally up to, this last week. And yet we see that legacy squandered in really profound and important ways over the course of the next decade. We lose the nuance as a nation that the war on terror is not a war on Islam, it's not a war on Muslims. And we see this incredibly vitriolic and vile thread of American politics come to the fore of nativism and white nationalism that is in many ways a direct reaction to the politics of 9/11 and thereafter. Part of what is so challenging about looking back at the legacy of that day today, this is a really great uplifting way to end a super uplifting topic of discussing 9/11, but that day has, in the end, 20 years later, left us more polarized, more partisan, and more divided as a nation and as a world than we were on 9/11 itself. And I can draw a very straight line for you in our politics from 9/11 to the election of Barack Obama, and then a straight line from the 9/11 to the election of Donald Trump, and a straight line from 9/11 to the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th. And that, unfortunately, is a really dark legacy for a day that first generated such unity and love and hope around the world.
Well, Garrett, thank you so much for this conversation. It is greatly appreciated. And I will pass things over to Gina, who is going to wrap up today's program.
Thank you for this extraordinary hour. I just wanted to remind everyone out there that to submit any student question for a chance to win a $50 gift certificate from the Gilder Lehrman gift shop for you and your teacher. And also wanted to let everyone know about some upcoming programs we have. Also remind everyone to purchase The Only Plane in the Sky. You can do that through the Gilder Lehrman bookshop, and Allison has put that in the chat, and I encourage everyone to get this book because it's just extraordinary. And the next book breaks next Sunday. We'll be discussing JFK, Coming of Age in the American Century, and then that'll be followed by an Inside the Vault featuring Allison here, and they'll be discussing Benedict Arnold, John Andre, and the aftermath of their treasonous plot. And Garrett, your next book is on Watergate, is that correct? So that's what people can be.
It is. It'll be coming out in February. The first single volume soup to nuts narrative history of Watergate written since the 1990s. So the first time we've ever known the name of Deep Throat.
Wow. Well, and I want to encourage everyone to visit us at gilderlehrman.org for documents, essays, digital exhibitions, the Hamilton Education Program, and so much more. And a special thank you again to the History Channel. And thank you to you, Garrett and Allison, for this amazing discussion today. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your week.